Morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm the co-director of the Center for Ideas in Society, and I'm a professor in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies here at UC Riverside. It's truly a privilege and an honor to welcome you to today's event, Israel and Palestine, Possible Futures, a discussion with Noam Chomsky. I'm grateful to the event co-sponsors, the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies and the Program in Middle East and Islamic Studies for inviting the center to be part of this event. And I'm especially grateful to participate in this event. For those who are unfamiliar, many North American universities now include boilerplate land acknowledgements in the introduction of campus events. I humbly dissent from this practice of acknowledgement by offering and urging and provocation toward activation, mobilization, and collective study and movement against conditions of occupation, anti-Black violence, and coloniality. I like to open this occasion by acknowledging Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside, including epistemological, archival, and physical forms of Indigenous thought and being. The University of California as a whole is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by original and ongoing human caretakers, in this case, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. This colonial institution continues to be populated by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is blocks away from the site where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller not long before I started working here. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which the university has a cooperating police relationship, is regionally and nationally notorious for creating cruel and fatal conditions in local jails for people who are awaiting trial and cannot afford bail. It's a shared responsibility to address how the University of California is actively complicit in long and ongoing histories of anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It's thus with a sense of urgent obligation that I offer these words in place of the sanctioned institutional so-called land acknowledgement. I'm honored to open this precious occasion by urging all of us to build on Rupert and Jeanette Costo's example by seeking new and old ways to create decolonized, abolitionist, and liberated futures. Welcome, everybody. With that, I pass the mic to my colleague, Professor Michael Alexander.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Dylan. Professor Noam Chomsky, I'd like to welcome you and all of our guests with some words from the Mishnah, the words of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon would say, the day is short, the work is much, and the workers are lazy, and the reward is great, and the master of the house is pressing. And he would also say, you're not obliged to finish the work, but neither are you free to neglect it. Professor Chomsky, in your 95th year, you are still doing the work. Thank you for being with us here today. For our guests joining us, I'm Michael Alexander. I'm the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies at UCR, together with my colleague, Professor Muhammad Ali, the director of the Program in Middle East and Islamic Studies. We've created this very special series, Israel and Palestine, Possible Futures. And with it, we hope to offer a venue for knowledgeable people from all points of view to speculate about real needs, realistic steps, and possible positive directions toward more equitable conditions in the region. Professor Ali will have the honor of introducing our speaker, but let me now just acknowledge the Center for Ideas in Society, which is hosting us today, director or co-director Dylan Rodriguez, also the co-director Jeanette Cole, who is sitting in from Germany right now. And I would also like to thank our friends from UCR Palm Desert, who in fact helped us initiate this series last year. Thank you for being here. And then finally, an acknowledgement to the students of the Middle East Student Center and Omar Aziz, the director of that center, and the students of Hillel and the director of that center, Aran Weisman, and all the students, faculty who have come here to learn something. Today, I'm here as a student to learn something along with you. So with that, I pass the microphone to Professor Ali, who will introduce our speaker. Then each of us will ask a question of our speaker, and then we will open it up to Q&A through the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael Alexander and Professor Dylan Rodriguez. I'm very happy and very pleased to be part of this panel. I would like to introduce myself first. Muhammad Ali. I'm the director of Middle East and Islamic Studies program. I work on Indonesian Islam, but I also work with other colleagues here working on Middle East from different departments. And I would like to introduce our speaker today. Professor Noam Chomsky is an academic and public intellectual known as founder of modern linguistics. He is laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and is author and contributor to over 100 books. I cannot imagine 100 books on on political topics, with a very wide range of topics, not only in linguistics, but also US foreign policy, globalization, labor, geopolitics, language, culture, society, you name it. But for this particular occasion, we would like to have Professor Chomsky to talk more about Israel-Palestinian questions and possible futures for this crisis. An observer of Israel and the Middle East from his first stay on kibbutz in a kibbutz in 1953, Professor Chomsky recently referred to Israel as the leading issue of my life since early childhood. Okay, so let me just begin our conversation here. So we have so many narratives. We have so many claims regarding Palestine and Israel issues. In other words, we have competing narratives. So I was wondering, Professor Chomsky, what do you think is the key problem of Israel-Palestinian issue that we can start with? Where's the key or root cause, root problem underlying all the questions, all the problems, political, religious, economics, land, and so on and so forth? What do you think is the key problem here that we are dealing with? Even until today, we have 5 days of violence, and now it's a temporary truce, ceasefire, right? But it's a deja vu question. It's still on, and it seems like so many people are very pessimistic about the future of this problem. But what do you think?
Well, the key questions have changed over the years. The major question was recognized, formulated, discussed 120 years ago by leading figures in the Jewish community, leading analysts, commentators, people like the great essayist was known as Chadam pseudonym, one of the creators of the modern Hebrew language and Hebrew culture. He visited Palestine in about 120 years ago, I guess, and came back and said, look, we have to understand that the people, it's not a land without people. There are people there, they're settled, they don't want us to invade. What he proposed is what was called cultural Zionism. Jews should set up a cultural center in Palestine, which would reinvigorate the diaspora. This is, remember, before the Holocaust, before East European Jews were basically destroyed. So that was the main center of Jewish life. He said we should revitalize Jewish culture and language, create a new civilization, and its center should be in Palestine. Others, like Yitzhak Epstein, others made essentially the same things. Then came the question of how to deal with these facts. No time to run over the history now, it's complicated history, but moving on to the recent period, since 1967, was totally new period. I mean, plenty happened before, of course, but in 1967, Israel conquered Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights. And from that point on, almost immediately, incidentally, U.S. relations with Israel changed radically at that point. And that's quite important for the U.S. That's us, has a decisive, you and I have a decisive role in what happens there. It's not something far away. Whatever Israel does, it's because you and I permit it to happen. It's the United States who provides the massive support for everything that goes on. It's the United States that vetoes Security Council resolutions calling for an end to illegal occupation and so on. So it's not remote. It's our responsibility. We should not forget. That changed substantially in 1967. Prior to that, U.S. relations with Israel were friendly, but not particularly unusual. In fact, Israel's main military support was coming from France. Its nuclear programs were developed with French inputs. U.S. was not supporting them. So 67 changed everything. Israel performed an enormous service to the United States. It destroyed secular Arab nationalism. The United States had taken over domination of the Middle East from Britain. Britain had previously run most of the world, particularly the United States. But in 1945, Britain essentially took over the mantle of global domination from Britain, and the Middle East was a central component. There was a conflict in the Middle East, many conflicts. Britain, throughout its control, had tended to support radical Islam in opposition to secular nationalism. For good reasons, secular nationalism can get out of control. Radical Islam, they assume, they can maintain control over it. The United States took over the same position. 1967, there was an actual war going on between the center of radical Islam, Saudi Arabia, and the center of secular nationalism, Egypt. They were at war in the Yemen, a substantial war. Israel destroyed secular nationalism, supported radical Islam, started a love affair with the United States. It was a tremendous gift. It also changed American discussion. Prior to that, Israel had not been a huge issue, even among American Jews. In fact, prior to 1967, there wasn't even much talk about the Holocaust. Holocaust museums, Holocaust studies, all of this is post-1967. Everything changed significantly. And at that point, Israel began a program of systematic expansion into the occupied territories to take up with the basic goal of taking over whatever it found valuable and leaving out the Palestinian population. So Israel does not want Nablus, for example. There's too many Arabs. The goal is to take what's valuable, expel the population if you can. The ones you can't expel, surround them, ignore them, but essentially take it over. The United States has supported it every step of the way. Golan Heights, Israel simply annexed in violation of Security Council orders. Actually, the U.S. joined Security Council in opposing it, but then went on to ignore it, and under Trump formally authorized it. Jerusalem, Israel, again, basically annexed in violation of Security Council orders. U.S. tolerated it, Jerusalem is now about 5 times what it ever was. Historically, it took in surrounding Arab villages, and through the West Bank, pretty much the same. Gaza we can go into. Well, that's the basic story. In the early 1970s, Israel had a choice. It had a choice between expansion and security, and it chose expansion with the help of the United States. What happened is there was a resolution, several resolutions brought to the UN Security Council, which called for a 2-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, so-called Green Line, with maybe minor adjustments, and called for the recognition, I'm virtually quoting now, the recognition of the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The resolution was supported by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, so-called confrontation states, tacitly supported by the PLO, not openly. Israel strongly objected to it, refused even to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. That pretty much set the stage for what happened, has been happening since. Israel at that time was expanding into the Egyptian Sinai. That was a crucial issue. But the basic point was, is it going to be expansion or security? And Israel chose expansion, which means almost total reliance on the United States, because it becomes, of course, there's plenty of international objection. And finally, at this point, it's almost become an international pariah. But as long as it has US support, it feels it can go ahead. It brings us up to the present, when Israel has been shifting. It was predictable in 1967 and predicted, in fact, that if Israel continued with the occupation, it would become harsher, more brutal internally. One of the most respected figures in Israeli society, pretty much a traditional Jewish sage of Yeshayahu Leibovitz, highly regarded. He went so far as to say that if Israel continued the occupation, it would become a country of what he called Judeo-Nazis. Only somebody like Leibovitz could have gotten away with saying that, but others were saying similar things in more muted tones. We've seen it happen. Then the dynamics are pretty straightforward. You have your boot on somebody's neck. You have to find a way of justifying it. It does something to you internally, anybody, a country too. So the country has shifted pretty far to the right. By now, it's one of the very few countries where young people are more reactionary than their parents, more extreme nationalist and racist and so on. Parents sort of remember the older days when there was a social democratic liberal community, but by now almost disappeared. It's now a religious nationalist government, which, like it or not, has plenty of popular support. There's an interesting article you might look at in today's edition of Haaretz, the major Israeli newspaper, the English edition. It compares Turkey and Israel and points out that in Turkey, as in Israel, whether you like it or not, a religious nationalist element is the majority, which is opposed to democracy. He said, so we have to recognize, we don't like it, but you can't pretend it's not happening. In fact, similar things are true elsewhere. You take a look at Iran, a lot of repression by a brutal government. There's plenty of popular support. You go to the rural areas, deeply religious areas find extensive support for the guardian council of harsh, brutal clerics. These are things we may not like them, but the world doesn't go away if they don't like it. And the case of Israel is like that. It's pretty much where we stand today. So the key issues have changed, but the basic one that was recognized by Ahad Ha'am remains.
Thank you for that, Professor Chomsky. And as we proceed, I just want to acknowledge the 75th anniversary and the grieving mourning of Nakba as we continue. And I wanted, if with your patience and with gratitude to you, I wanted to preface my own question by bringing forward the gravity and the incisiveness of some of your recent analysis of Israel's ongoing occupation and repression of Palestine and Palestinians in particular. And I was thinking through, I was reviewing some of the things that you've been saying in recent years. So I want to pull some stuff out and then maybe use those passages from things you've said recently to frame my question. So this is from a 2021 interview you did in Truth Out, where you said, for what's become the dominant tendency in the Zionist movement, there has been a fixed long-term goal. Put crudely, the goal is to rid the country of Palestinians and replace them with Jewish settlers cast as the quote unquote rightful owners of the land, returning home after millennia of exile. That was 2021. From an interview you did with Middle East Monitor in 2022, you reiterated, I've held for a long time that the occupied territories are much worse than South Africa. For the Palestinians in the occupied territories, Israel just wants to get rid of the people, doesn't want them. And its policies for the past 50 years with not much variation have been just somehow making life unlivable. So the Palestinian people will go somewhere else. And finally, another passage from an interview you did with Al Jazeera just this past couple months. The creation of a quote unquote greater Israel, which maybe you can elaborate that point for folks who are in attendance who aren't familiar with that concept, Professor Chomsky. The creation of a quote unquote greater Israel, which will take over. Everything that's of value to Israel will leave out the Palestinian population concentrations. The greater Israel has to maintain a large Jewish majority in a racist Jewish-dominated state. So that means take over the Jordan Valley, kick out the population. One or another pretext is used, and then it turns into Jewish settlements. By now, the Palestinians who are left in the regions that Israel is integrating and planning to take over are divided into about 160 or so small enclaves surrounded by Israeli forces, which may or may not allow Palestinians to tend their crops, tend their livestock, pick their olives, and so on, basically in prison. And the idea is to try to see if we can just get rid of them somehow. So as I continue into my question, first, let me just say how much I appreciate the intellectual honesty of these and other statements that you've recently made about the conditions of occupation confronted by Palestinians, and the way that your public attention to these conditions, in my view, helps to both demystify and reframe what the everyday consequences of the ongoing occupation actually are. I think your framing, alongside other folks' framings, provides a context for the militancy and urgency of the various forms of Palestinian resistance and liberation-focused mobilizations that have been happening in recent times. So this leads to my question, and thank you for bearing with me. Your unapologetic descriptions of Israel as a militarized settler colonial apartheid and occupation warfare state suggests that it may be engaging in policies and activities, both extra-legal and fully juridically rationalized and justified, that fit the description of genocide against the Palestinian people in these geographies of occupation. And here I'm thinking of a robust genealogy in the scholarly and juridical notions of genocide that span from Raphael Lemkin to the internally contentious definition created by the United Nations, to frameworks created by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Black liberation thinkers. Is it possible to consider the condition that you've described in my extended preface? Is it possible to think about this as a genocidal condition? And that's my question. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Well, start with the word genocidal. I've almost stopped using it. It has been so vulgarized and politicized over the years that it's become almost useless. Anything somebody we don't like does that's horrible, we call genocide. I mean, Lemkin would be turning over in his grave. It's not what he meant by genocide. So the word has been, again, vulgarized, politicized, become virtually unusable. You're a specialist on Indonesia, right? The US backed Suharto coup, killed hundreds of thousands of people, imposed a vicious terror state, one of the worst in the world, strong US support. Was that genocide? Suharto then went on to immediately to invade East Timor, killed about a third of the population. Relative to population, one of the worst crimes of the post-Second World War period. Does anybody call it genocide? No, because we supported it. Since we supported it, it's maybe an error or something like that, but can't be anything more than that. Somebody else that we don't like kills a couple thousand people, genocide. You know, you can't use the word anymore. It's been destroyed. The concept should be there, but it isn't. As far as apartheid is concerned, I've never really agreed with the idea of calling Israel an apartheid state for many years. I've tried to explain why. Within Israel proper, within the Green Line, what's legally Israel, there's repression of Palestinians. I've seen plenty of it, but it's not apartheid. It's severe repression of the kind we're not unfamiliar with in the United States. On the other hand, if you go to the occupied territories, I think it's much worse than apartheid. Take a look at South Africa. They weren't trying to get rid of the Black population. It was 85% of the population. They relied on the Black population as their workforce. In fact, the South African racists tried to get international recognition for the Bantustans. They tried to give them some level of support, you know, make them look viable, hoping that they would get international recognition for it. That was apartheid, hideous, horrible regime. But what Israel's doing in the occupied territories is much worse. It doesn't want to get international recognition for the 160 enclaves that you mentioned. It wants to make life unlivable for them. Jordan Valley, it's about a third of the arable land in the West Bank, had a couple 100,000 Palestinians, mostly gone, driven out in one way or another, all sorts of techniques, you know, declare a military zone so people aren't allowed to live there, and then put in a Nachal, it's called, a semi-militarized Jewish settlement. Then pretty soon it's a full Jewish settlement, and so on. All sorts of devices and techniques to quietly get rid of the population. The goal as the greater Israel, you pretty much described it in your comments, but just to expand, Israel takes over the Golan Heights now with US authorization, alone in the world. Gaza is a special horror story we can talk about, but in the West Bank, Jerusalem has been vastly expanded, way beyond what it ever was, annexed by Israel. US alone supports that, maybe one or two small US dependencies, but then established settlements to the east of Jerusalem. Ma'ale Adumim is to the couple, maybe 20, 30 kilometers to the east of Jerusalem, major settlement, mostly built up during the Clinton years. It's it basically bisects the habitable part of the West Bank. There's a road between Jerusalem. There's a corridor called E1 between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, which Israel wants to develop and build and is slowly doing over international objection. North to the north, settlements like Ariel, Kedumim, deep inside the West Bank, again, integrated into Israel. They cut up the region into other subdivisions. I don't know if you visited the West Bank, but if you do, if you drive on one of the what are called Palestinian roads, say from, as I've done, from Jerusalem to Ramallah, you practically, if it's raining, you can fall into the wadi next to it. Takes you an hour for a 10-minute drive if you happen to make it. If you go on one of the Jewish roads, a super highway, you're there in 10 minutes, There's a integrated development, infrastructure development throughout the West Bank, integrating the settlements into Israel. Most of the people who live in the West Bank, say Ma'ale Adumim, go there because for the same reason that people go to nice suburbs in the United States, except there it's subsidized. You can get a subsidized villa in a nice suburban area. There's a super highway that takes you to your job in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. You don't even know there's an Arab anywhere. The roads are restricted to Israelis and visitors. And this along with the many hundreds of enclaves, cuts the West Bank into a region which is integrated into Israel. Long run will be annexed to Israel if the US permits it, supports it, and leaves the Palestinians hanging on a vine, surrounded by plenty of violence. There's the settler youth, as they're called, mostly religious. Many from the United States are very violent and brutal. They're supported by the army. You live in terror half the time. If you read a correspondent like, say, Gidon Levy in Haaretz, every day there's another atrocity in the West Bank, low level enough so that it doesn't make the headlines here, but that's life. The idea is somehow get rid of them. That's not apartheid, it's much worse. Within Israel itself, most of this isn't even known. Younger Israelis, polls show, don't even know there's a green line. They don't know there's a border. And if you travel there, you don't see it, The city of Tel Aviv recently tried to use maps in the schools that designated the international border. Government barred them. Can't show a map that shows the international border. Well, I don't think the word apartheid is quite right for this. It's worse. But in Israel itself, Palestinians have a repressive rule in many ways, ugly, but I wouldn't call it apartheid. And as I say, as far as the term genocide is concerned, I think it's become unusual.
I hope it's okay if I ask a quick follow-up, Professor Chomsky. Could you say something for our attendees that are unfamiliar with it about the Greater Israel project and how it kind of demystifies or gives lie to some of the discourse and the problematic that gets set up about the so-called two-state solution? Could you say more about that for folks?
Well, there's the usual debate in the United States, Israel, and elsewhere is between a two-state settlement and a one-state settlement. The debate is pretty much beside the point because it is overlooking a third alternative, which is the one that is being implemented. It's not abstract. That's Greater Israel. Greater Israel is what we've been describing. Take over the Syrian Golan Heights, vastly expanded Jerusalem, settlements to the east, infrastructure, take over the Jordan Valley, third of the arable land, everything's enclosed. The major Palestinian population concentrations just ignore. We don't want them because it has to be a majority Jewish state. Then we can call it a democratic Jewish state try to fool the outsiders this way. So Nablus is outside, Tulkarm is outside. Refugee camps like Jenin are under brutal military attack constantly. Scattered settlements of Palestinians, about 160 of them surrounded by Israeli troops, which sometimes randomly will allow a Palestinian farmer to go out and water his crops, tend his cattle, but basically saying, get out of here, you don't belong. That's Greater Israel. It's being constructed before our eyes with total US support. You and I pay the taxes for it. We're doing it. You can blame Israel if you like, but you can also look in a mirror. We don't have to pay that. In fact, US aid to Israel is technically illegal under US law. There's Palestinian solidarity groups should be pressing this issue, and it's finally beginning to come into the public eye. But that's Greater Israel. As long as Israel has the option of Greater Israel, it's not going to accept either a one-state or a two-state settlement. And the reason it has the option is because the United States strongly supports it. That's the reason. So it's not over there. It's right here where we are.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those responses.
Okay, well, I think that my colleagues asked, you answered questions that I was going to ask if you had any, if the green line, if there's any hope for a green line solution, but it doesn't sound like you're very, not just not optimistic, but that, I mean, so I was at the Hebrew University in the year 1993 and 1994, which was a very optimistic year with people shaking hands on the White House lawn. And it seemed that there was a moment where some kind of an agreement based on a green line might have been a possibility. Is that, in terms of practically looking forward, is that a direction where people should be pushing, or is that an option that is no longer on the table?
I think it's basically up to the United States. If the United States were to stop, one of the things that I said pointed out that in 1970, Israel made a decision which rendered it subordinate to the US. It depends totally on US power because of the decision to sacrifice security in the favor of expansion. When the US demands something, Israel has to follow it. Just doesn't have choices. In fact, every US president prior to Obama, he was the first, every president prior to Obama had enforced decisions on Israel to which it was strongly opposed, but to which it had to obey, could run through it if there's detail. Stopped with Obama, well, demanded nothing. And of course, Trump just offered Israel whatever it wanted. And Biden hasn't changed that. But if the United States stops supporting the occupation, informs Israel that it must pull its troops, which are illegally in the occupied areas, bear in mind that every international authority and every country in the world, even the United States, regards the occupied territories as occupied. Israel is alone in claiming they're not occupied. Israel calls them administered territories, alone in the world. That's the famous Israeli Supreme Court that everyone is lauding now, was alone in saying it's not occupied. But it is occupied by every standard. Everything that's going on there is illegal. The settlements are illegal. The presence of the IDF, the International Israeli Army, is illegal. If the United States says game is over, it's over. Go back to Indonesia again, because there's an interesting analogy. You may recall that in 1999, Indonesia was occupying East Timor, criminally, murderous, brutal occupation. And these Indonesian generals were saying, we're never going to leave. We don't care what anybody says. Well, there was a lot of pressure on Clinton, international and domestic. And finally, he decided to withdraw US support for the Indonesian occupation and slaughter. He made a quiet comment saying, game is over. Indonesian military pulled out, ended the occupation. You have to understand what power means in the international arena. It's not a joke. When Clinton gave the order, they pulled out after having said they never would. If the United States gives the orders to Israel, it doesn't have many choices. It's conceivable that this religious nationalist government might say, we've got God on our side, so we don't care. In that case, they're in really deep trouble. But any other government will have to exceed the US demands. So if the US changes, I don't mean in 1 second, if the US stops supporting the occupation, moves towards gradual removal of the Israeli army, remember that most of the settlers, most of them are there for basically economic reasons. You have a nice subsidized villa in a pleasant suburb. You can move from there to a subsidized apartment inside Israel. They might not like it, like people in the United States, if they were forced to leave a nice suburb and go to the city, might not like it, but it's not the end of the world. I think it's feasible. I think some kind of arrangement can be made with maybe territorial exchanges, one-to-one exchanges, other possibilities. There are possibilities on the table. So the Geneva negotiations of 2003 between high-level Israeli and high-level Palestinian negotiators came to a sort of a reasonable set of proposals. It wasn't formal. It was just worked out on the ground by pretty high-level activists. The United States strongly opposed it. Israel rejected it, but it could be implemented, I think. So I don't think it's impossible. In fact, I think it's about the only short-term feasible move. I don't think it's a very pleasant one. All my life, I've been in favor of what was once a live movement in Israel, a binational movement calling for an Arab-Jewish federation and a cooperative Palestinian state with a Jewish cultural home along Haddam's style. I think that's still feasible and a better long-term solution, but step by step. I think in the current situation, the only feasible short-term solution is some kind of resolution along the lines of the Geneva proposals, which I think are worth looking at carefully. Is it feasible? I think so. I don't see anything else that is.
Okay. Well, I agree with an awful lot that you're saying. I want to follow up on your hope for the further future regarding binationality. Okay, so if I understand your scientific work correctly, you've contributed a great deal to our understanding of our phylogenetic inheritance, our inborn capacities. And our phylogeny appears to have an extraordinary capacity to organize people into identities of friend and foe, us and them, and even chimpanzee communities patrol their borders and they kill strangers. And so the nation state, Wilson's dream of ethnically self-determination states, was some hope to organize us out, no thems, just us. They was an attempt to organize states around particular ethnicities. But we know that in practical terms, that currently there are 193 nations represented at the United Nations, while there are probably 1,000 or 2,000 different ethnicities. And so the rules of the game in forming the states, all states, is to shore up ethnic power, to subjugate all rival groups, or to ethnically cleanse rival groups. It seems to be the rules of the game in terms of building a state. So Jews have been victims of that logic in Europe and throughout the Middle East. They've been ethnically cleansed in both locations. And Jews, as Israelis, have been perpetrators of this kind of logic. And so I'm very interested to hear you talk about Ahad Ha'am and what kind of a vision you have for the Jewish presence in the Levant.
Well, first of all, I'd be very cautious about anything that's said about basic human nature or chimpanzee nature.
Okay.
On chimpanzee stories, it's been mostly exploded. Chimpanzees pretty much get along with each other until Europeans come in and start eliminating the grazing grounds and setting up competition. It's a great book by Brian Ferguson that just came out of Rutgers Press, going into all of this in detail. So chimpanzee stories are quite different. In fact, equally close to us genetically in evolution are bonobos, who are called nature's hippies. They cooperate. They're maternal matrilineal societies, friendly, cooperative, and even chimpanzees are nowhere near as harsh and brutal as claimed. A lot of that is the effect of European colonization. But as far as humans are concerned, plenty of cooperation. Lots of examples of nation states are a pretty recent innovation. Take the Middle East, okay? You go back, take the Ottoman Empire. Nobody wants to go back to the Ottoman Empire with its corruption and brutality, but think about it a little. Under the Ottoman Empire, you could travel from Cairo to Istanbul to Baghdad without a visa. It's just one complicated community. If you're a Greek in Beirut, you have the Greek community where you run your own affairs, but you get along fine with the other communities next door. Well, is that possible? I think so. In fact, I think we should aim to go beyond binationalism. We should erode the borders. The borders in the Middle East were imposed by British and French imperialism for their own interests. They had nothing to do with the interests of the people there. They break up people who are of the same communities in ugly, vicious ways. It's true of the Israel-Lebanon border. I mean, I'll tell you an anecdote. The first time I visited Israel, you mentioned, was 1953. I was early 20s, you know, hitchhiking like a young kid, hitchhiking in northern Galilee one evening, backpack, all that stuff. You know what it's like. A Jeep pulled up in a road behind me, and a guy got out of the Jeep and started yelling at me in Hebrew, saying, "Come back, come back." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "You're in Lebanon. The border is, and now it's an armed camp. Then there was no border. And there can't be it's nothing. If you've traveled in the Galilee, it's totally arbitrary. The British and French imposed it for their own imperial reasons. Absolutely no reason to honor that. And the same is true of the whole system. You could move back to a regional system of basically the Ottoman type without the corruption and brutality. That's a long-term settlement, and I think the same is true of most of the world. In fact, it's rather striking in Europe. Just take a look at the recent history of Europe. For centuries, the highest goal of French and Germans was to slaughter each other. One of the most vicious, violent regions of the world. Major war after major war. 17th century, about a third of the population of Germany was wiped out on religious wars. Goes on up until 1945. 1945, they realized it's got to end. We can't go on like this. Now, France and Germany are part of a unified community, European Union. It's not perfect, plenty wrong with it, but it's a lot better than slaughtering each other. Plenty of cooperation. You're a student in Italy, you can take you get your degree in Germany. No borders, well, happened in one generation after centuries of savage mutual slaughter. I think that indicates the possibilities that human nature provides. Other cases like that.
Thank you for that that amazing optimism, because it's hard to have some optimism sometimes in discussing these issues. We want to turn to the Q&A here. And my colleagues, I don't know if you've been reading some of the questions. I haven't really had a chance. So if you see something good, can you call it?
All right. I can read some of the questions here, Professor Chomsky. Okay. One of the first questions we have here, why does US have some support? Why US is always supporting Israel? What are some of the reasons why US always support Israel? And because you said that US support is very crucial in this perpetuation of the occupations.
Well, the basic support, as I say, it basically changed in 1967 when Israel became what the United States regards as a major strategic asset. It's a major base for US power in the region. And American opinion changed radically in support of Israel at that time. Well, after that, lots of other factors enter. The Jewish community, for the first time, picked up Israel as a major issue, a lot of lobbying and so on. More recent years, the huge evangelical community has become strongly supportive of Israel, basically on deep anti-Semitic grounds. Evangelicals are the main support for Israel, for Israeli extremism today. Why? Read their literature. Because it's going to lead to Armageddon. Everybody will be wiped out. All the Jews go to eternal damnation. Those who recognize Christ survive. Can't get more anti-Semitic than that. Even Hitler didn't come that close. But that's the strongest base for support of Israel and Israeli violence and extremism. The security systems in the United States are very closely integrated with Israel. Israel's major military industry, Rafael, has its headquarters in Washington. They're just totally integrated. That's a big base of support. Ultranationalists in the United States are major support. Support among what are called liberal Americans for Israel has been declining. You look at polls, there's more support for Palestinians than Israel among them, especially true of younger people, including young Jews. So there's a lot, but in the background is the major strategic role of Israel as the solid, reliable base for US power in the region. US even stores weapons in Israel for use in elsewhere in the region if it needs them. Very close interconnection. And there's no other reliable base. Actually, the CIA and others have pointed this out in internal documents. So there's an overlay of reasons, popular pressures, strategic reasons, all integrated.
So, okay, if I ask a question, if I read one of the questions that just came in from our colleague James Anderson, I'll read it in its entirety. The Committee to Protect Journalists released a report last week noting that 20 journalists have been killed by the IDF since 2001. 18 of those reporters were Palestinian and 2 were European foreign correspondents. The CPJ report also noted Israeli officials have accused reporters of terrorism. Can Professor Chomsky comment on the importance of covering Palestinian repression inside Israel, as well as what happens in the occupied territories? And what role does Professor Chomsky think organizing and mobilizing to defend and support journalists covering the ongoing repression and the illegal occupation should play in international solidarity with Palestinian people and in the efforts of people interested in creating conditions for libertarian socialist societies that embody the best of what Professor Chomsky experienced with kibbutzim?
It's tough. I mean, Israel and Turkey, in fact, Turkey's even worse. Journalists are getting killed all the time. Yes, they need international support. This is particularly true for Palestinians who are targets, including American citizens, Palestinians. We've just seen the cases that we know. So they need strong international solidarity. It's a difficult business. I've traveled through the West Bank, breaking military curfew, which can be done. It's ugly and difficult. And for journalists trying to do an honest job, it's not easy. There are some who do. I mentioned Gideon Levy, Amira Haas, who actually lives in Ramallah. She couldn't stand living in Israel any longer. Did wonderful work in Gaza before she was kicked out and now in the West Bank, and there are others. And for Palestinians, of course, it's far more difficult because they're targets, not just journalists. So yes, of course, we should give whatever solidarity we can. Journalists in Turkey, which is probably the worst place, many other places.
I have a question from one of our colleagues regarding the protest movements in Israel by the center left. Do you see these protest movements as presenting some avenue of optimism in that the center of Israel has found more of a voice? What do you make of these movements regarding the Constitution and the building and the perhaps writing of a Constitution, and generally the voice of the left that seems to have emerged, at least to a certain degree?
Well, my friends are out there protesting, and I support them in the protest. But the fact of the matter is, the main thrust of the protest is very limited. It's for rights of Israeli Jews inside Israel. Very little concern for the crushing of Palestinians right next door. A little, you see, bits and pieces, but not a great deal. In fact, some of the heroes of the protest movement are some of the worst criminals, like Defense Minister Yoav Gallant or Benny Gantz. They're considered heroes of the protesters. You take a look at their record in Gaza, they should be facing the International Criminal Court. Vicious, brutal record. Unfortunately, these issues are much too dissociated. Not all. There are some among the protesters who are bringing them up. Take even the Supreme Court. Now defending the Supreme Court has become the top issue for the protesters, and they're right. If the Supreme Court is gone, Israel it'll be a much worse country, much more reactionary, much more brutal. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has a terrible record in the occupied areas. It'll occasionally delay an illegal settlement for a couple of months and allow it through a backhanded way. It doesn't even recognize that it's an occupation. There's a lot of problems. In fact, if you You may remember, I don't know if you've seen it, a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, roughly, Israel's major legal correspondent, Moshe Negbi, his name is, wrote a book called Kistom Hayinu. We were like Sodom. We were major criminals. It's all about legal and other corruption inside Israel. Does talk about the terrible record in the occupied territories, but there are real problems. So yes, I think the protesters can maybe help fend off the worst, but it's not a protest that's going to the heart of the issues. I should also say something else. The popular support for the government is mostly what are called Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews, Jews from the Arab countries. They've been very badly treated throughout the history of Israel. I've seen it myself. I could tell you stories about it. Israel for a long time was run by an Ashkenazi elite, people like us, educated, professional, secular, maybe left, center left, but harshly repressing the Jewish population, the Arab population of Arab origin, and they bitterly resented it. A lot of them are very religious, not all. There are groups like the Black Panthers that emerged about 40 years ago, I guess, trying to support the rights of Moroccan Jews and other protesters. That's a lot of support for Menachem Begin, oddly considering what he was. But those are factors we have to consider too. It's not, life is a complicated affair.
All right. Did my colleagues see any questions, or do you have time for another question? One more? Yeah.
One more, or we have still time?
We have some time, but I just want to make sure that Professor Chomsky is,
Right.
your energy is good. So,
Right.
Okay, I see a question that I'd like to know about it. 75 years on, both internally displaced and external Palestinian refugees are still holding on to their internationally recognized right to return to their lands. How does that factor into the future prospects of the region? That is from Mohammed Sheikh is asking that question.
Well, we have to be a little bit cautious about this too. First of all, is there an internationally recognized right? If it ever comes to a serious legal tribunal, any Israeli lawyer can argue and win, saying there's no internationally recognized right. So you really have to be cautious about pressing this issue. The right is based on General Assembly Resolution 194. General Assembly resolutions are recommendations. They do not confer rights. Any Israeli lawyer can bring this up if it ever comes to a real debate and discussion. So first of all, be cautious. There's a moral right, but it's not a legally established right. And even Resolution 194 was qualified. But the other point to recognize is that we know it will never happen. There is not going to be, it's an ugly world. It's not a pretty world, but we can't pretend that it doesn't exist. If there was, the PLO has understood this for 50 years. It's understood that the most that can be hoped for is some kind of symbolic return, family reunification, small groups, and so on. But millions of Palestinians coming back to Israel will never happen. There's no international support for it. If it ever developed, Israel would use its ultimate weapons, up to nuclear weapons, to prevent it. So it's simply not going to happen. And we shouldn't dangle in front of poor people's eyes hopes that are never going to be realized. I mean, I visited refugee camps in Lebanon, Sabra Shatila camp, for example. It's pitiful, it's painful. You get invited into a small room where a Palestinian family lives in a horrible slum, greeted with the usual Palestinian warm welcomes, cup of tea, and so on. And they show you the key to their home in Galilee, which they're never going to give up. What can you tell them? You can't tell them it's not going to happen, though you know it's not going to happen. Well, it is, in my view, immoral to dangle in front of people the hopes that they know will never be realized. I don't know how to, I mean, it's a terrible situation. Many like it in the world. Unfortunately, it's not going to go away.
Are we okay for another question, Professor Chomsky?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to ask this one from our colleague Jeff Sachs, who thanks you. He wonders about the term futurity, which is part of what frames the series that you're part of. Since Israel is a settler state, I wonder if you think we should be speaking or thinking about its futurity. Might other terms be more appropriate when we try to think about settler states? Should they have a future?
No. We shouldn't have states like the United States, the supreme settler colonial state. You know, are we going to get rid of it? No. We can say, yes, the settler colonial project, which virtually wiped out the indigenous population. You want to use the term genocide. This is one place where it fits. Knew exactly what they were doing consciously. Well, is it going to go out of existence? No. Where I'm sitting is occupied Mexico, conquered from Mexico in a brutal war of aggression. US conquered half of Mexico. Is it going to give it back? No, not in this universe. So yes, lots of hideous wrongs in the world. We live with the world as it is now. Can't help it. You can try to compensate for things that were done, but you can't reverse history.
I'm seeing mostly repetitions of things that you've covered. Are
Right.
my colleagues seeing anything new?
No,
I think there might be an interesting question, the very last one, which I think puts a little bit more, puts more emphasis on internal efforts by Palestinians to mount resistance against the Israeli state. So I don't think we've talked about that quite as much in this discussion. So maybe you could address that. This is the question that I'm paraphrasing the question, but Professor Chomsky suggesting that things could fundamentally change if the US demands for Israel to end the occupation. However, the question is asking, do you think that change could happen from within? And particularly thinking about the efforts by Palestinians from within. Is there anything Palestinians can do other than just hope that the US implausibly change their approach?
Palestinians can do plenty internally, just as repressed and occupied people have done throughout history. Let me give you an example which was just discovered recently. Abolitionism. Turns out it's very recently been discovered that Africans initiated abolitionism long before it developed in England, very strongly appealing to the Vatican, which was the ruling league, that was the international legal framework at the time. Back in the early time of the early Portuguese invasion, African slaves were organizing to appeal to the Vatican to ban slavery. They had a fair amount of success up to the point where the Vatican Council at least agreed to reduce the onerous, murderous conditions of slavery. That's the beginning of the abolitionist movement. All throughout history, oppressed, brutalized people have led the way towards their liberation. And the same is true of the Palestinians. Their resistance over the years has been phenomenal. What's called sumud in Arabic, just refusal to give up, maintaining their rights in dedicated, committed fashion. I've seen it personally in remarkable forms in Palestinian villages under attack, in refugee camps and elsewhere. That's, and that can now, the Palestinian solidarity groups in the United States and elsewhere can take the lead in these things, as solidarity groups have done in other cases. I mean, take East Timor, which I mentioned. It seemed almost inconceivable that a little place like East Timor could resist the invasion of a major power supported by the United States and its allies. How on earth could they resist? They did. Amazingly, huge massacre and destruction. Solidarity groups developed in the United States and England, finally pressured the US government to call off the slaughter, finally did. They survived. Things like that happen in the world. Many, and the Palestinians and the supporters can do it as well. They have a great record of resistance.
Okay, we have a good question here. It's from Boris Nunley, who's in our Black Study program. The term fascism is frequently deployed to explain an emerging zeitgeist. Is the term useful for this discussion? And I would just sort of tag on to that. The whole world seems to have descended into, but not just fascism, but just nationalism. I mean, everywhere. Is it worse? I mean, you're of a generation that's actually can remember and was influenced by the Spanish Civil War. I mean, so you have a long view of these matters, but I mean, are things descending into worse than they have been, or is this just sort of the way the world works, that there's these swings of nationalism and fascism?
There are swings. At the 80 years ago, which I can remember very well, it was the war, the Great War was finally coming to an end. It was becoming pretty clear that Russia would defeat Nazi Germany. The war in the Pacific was turning. The Japanese imperialism was being beaten back. The depression, deep depression, much worse than what we've suffered, was in everybody's minds. There was a wave of radical democracy all over the world saying, let's create a much better world out of the ashes of the depression and the Nazism, the hideous war. There's a long history of what happened after that. It had an effect for several decades. In the lead at that time was the United States. The New Deal was while Europe was descending into fascist horrors, the New Deal was the United States was moving towards social democracy under the pressure of a militant labor movement with a sympathetic administration, made many very positive changes in American life. We're still benefiting from them. There was a backlash from state power, from the business world, a long struggle since then. The last 40 years have been a period of bad regression, severe regression. Can it change again? Yes, it can. History doesn't have laws. History is determined by human will and human decisions. So yes, it can change, just as it changed in the 30s, just as it changed in much of the world after the Second World War. So we happen to be in a regressive period. Take the United States, most powerful country in the world. I mean, it's absolutely shocking that in a country like the United States, you see homeless people in the streets. It's beyond description. Extraordinary resources, advantages which no other country has, internal resources, homogeneous society, no security threats. I mean, every reason why it should be the richest, most advantaged country in the world. In many ways, it's the worst, has the worst social indicators, even has mortality increasing among white working class. These are scandals, and we know the reason for them. They're policy decisions. Policy decisions. It's policy decisions that in the last 40 years worked things out so that $50 trillion has been transferred from working people in the middle class to the top 1%. That's highway robbery on a massive scale. Didn't happen by laws of nature, didn't happen by laws of economics, happened by policy decisions, which can be reversed, okay? It's all within our hands, but you have to have the will, determination, engagement to struggle for it.
I mean, that sounds like a closing remark if I ever heard one. That's, are my colleagues ready to wrap? I mean, thank you very much. This has really been an amazing conversation. We have more questions in the chat, but they are, they're either unanswerable or they have been answered to a degree. Let's leave it at that.
And I think we'll be happy to post some of those unasked questions, maybe some of the ones that were asked in the comment section of the YouTube video once we post it.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ali, do you have any final comments or?
No, it's been great. So, I mean, we had a lot of questions, of course, and facts, perspectives, narratives, right? And I think one of the things that from myself, right, just listening to what Professor Chomsky is explaining and all the questions is coming, there is no peace without justice, but there is no justice without struggle. And I think every single human being should take part of this struggle. And I think people around the world, have the same kind of questions, not only in Palestine, but everywhere, including here in California, in Jakarta, in everywhere around the world, the same kind of questions, how we can participate, how we can, contribute to make a difference. And I think that's what I, can get from what we just heard. And that's so fascinating. It's wonderful and very enlightening and very critical, but at the same time, appreciative of all that comes to the discussion. So that's from me. And thank you so much, Professor Chomsky.
My pleasure. Pleasure to be with you.
Professor Chomsky, I just want to thank you as well on behalf of the Center for Ideas Society, and also just personally, somebody who's been reading your work for my entire adult life. It's just a real pleasure to meet you and to be part of this conversation with you. And I must tell you that you are the person from whom I learned the meaning of the term libertarian anarchist. So a deep debt of gratitude to you for teaching me what that term means.
Thank you.
Yeah, I am very grateful for you. Ali and I have been trying to create a space on campus where reasonable people can talk about how to create more equitable conditions. And people in our audience today, students, myself, we might not have liked one another's questions that you heard us ask. People might not have agreed with Professor Chomsky's answers, but we came together, we asked, we listened, we used both the ears that God gave us. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, that's the point of the university. And it's also, I think, the work that Rabbi Tarfon laid out for us, which is to figure out our own best actions concerning all the important matters of the day, including those discussed today regarding the possibility of creating more equitable conditions and circumstances in the region. So thank you, Professor Chomsky, for being here, and thank everyone who has participated today. And we will have more to come. We want to find more people of reasonable and learned view to come so that we can ask questions and use both of our ears.
Thank you again to everyone who attended, and thank you again, Professor Chomsky, for the intellectual honesty, the integrity, and the truth telling. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.